All right. This is Module 3, and this module is titled Clinical Psychology from the 1890s to World War II. Not the most accurate title, actually, but it was accurate when I first started teaching this class. Basically, it goes over some of the historical ground we've already covered, but with an emphasis on actually treating people in a clinical setting, asylums, uh, treatments people were trying out for addressing mental disorders, stuff like that. We are also going to advance into the 20th century and talk about Freud and psychoanalysis. And there's going to be a lot of emphasis placed early on principles of clinical reasoning, as I call it. Basically, is just a special kind of causal inference scientific method, but with, like I said, emphasis on clinical applications. So let me go over these real quick. By now in the course, you've probably encountered some of these from the readings, but in case you haven't, some things to consider if there's some clinical application, a therapy, a type of therapy, a type of strategy. Doesn't have to be for addressing mental disorders. It could be something you use while you're coaching people, managing people, uh, any kind of thing you try to do with people to try and address any kind of problem is a type of application or clinical application. Although most of the ones we're going to be talking about here have more to do with treating mental disorders. These same principles are important to consider regardless of what kind of application you're using. So the first thing is the fact that many phenomena that you're trying to reduce, such as a symptoms of a mental disorder or symptoms of a disease, many times these phenomena are self-limiting, which means they were going to end on their own. So, for instance, if you have a cold and you go out and buy some vitamin supplements and you take them, there's a good chance, or actually, it's virtually guaranteed, your cold was going to go away with or without the supplement. And anything else you try out, any kind of home remedies, chicken soup, it's always difficult to infer that what you did really helped or cured you if you were going to be cured on your own anyway. Um, Related to this is the fact that the symptoms of many problems fluctuate. So, if you are suffering from major depression, you have good days and you have bad days, unless you have, very severe depression. If you struggle with ADD or ADHD, there's some days where that's more of a problem and some days where it's less of a problem. In general, there are many variables you might try to affect in the world. Be, you might even not have anything to do with it, like with the economy or with unemployment. A lot of these things, like unemployment and even if you're trying to curb crime rates, a lot of these things are fluctuating up and down. And with the onset of a new clinical application, so in the case of depression, maybe you're trying some sort of new therapy where you flick your eyes around. That was a thing for a while. Or with ADD, ADHD, some people say you can cure mental disorders with your diet. So you start eating only things that are red. I've heard worse ideas, but you got to keep in mind that whenever you're trying to solve some sort of problem and the symptoms of that problem vary, they have ups and downs, you've got to think about, does my application merely coincide with a downtick in the severity of something, or can I establish that the downtick is uncharacteristically large given the overall amount of variation in this variable that I'm trying to control? And then there's also the placebo effect. The placebo effect is when because you expect something to work, or because you believe that something's going to work, you make it work. For instance, people will tell you that they're experiencing pain relief, or that they're experiencing a downturn in the severity of their symptoms, even if you give them a placebo, which is a chemically inert drug that appears to be a drug but actually has no active ingredients whatsoever. The placebo effect is very strong. So if you're using an ineffective treatment, you could have, it's not necessarily the specific active ingredients or the specific aspects of the treatment that you think is doing the work that's actually doing the work. Someone might say that a new type of therapy is working, that they're feeling better, when really it's not the new elements of the therapy that you're introducing. It's actually just the fact that the patient is taking some time to talk about themselves. They're investing money, so they kind of are hoping that this ends up working out. They want to justify the expense. There could be other things going on. And the power of suggestion is a very powerful power. And this kind of brings me to experimental control. There are a lot of confounding variables that muddy the waters when you're trying to infer that your treatment or your application or your therapy is doing the trick. If you try a new therapy, you got to use experimental control. You got to control all the other variables that could be influencing whether someone gets better or gets worse or not, and keep people in a control group and an experimental group as similar as possible in every respect, so that you can see that it's not just therapy itself that's helping, but it's the specific new parts of the therapy, let's say, that's helping. Also, making a study double blind is important. This is more relevant to pharmaceutical research. If you're testing a new drug, the people receiving the drug should not know that they have the placebo or the experimental drug. That would obviously be very bad. But it's also very well established that the people administering the drugs should also not know if they're administering the placebo drugs or the real drugs. Because it turns out people's body language and the way people talk to patients and clients are very telling. People can pick up on when you're not optimistic about their outlook, or when you're not expecting much to happen with them. This is all kind of related to the idea of correlation does not imply causation. I feel like everyone understands this idea, but just does not apply it in a consistent and disciplined way. The world that we live in is full of coincidences. Strange coincidences happen all the time. There are many explanations for every event. Anything that happens, if there's a downtick in crime, or if there's an uptick in crime, or if I don't know, if something happens with the economy, or if something happens in your life, you have a mental disorder and things seem to be going well, or things seem to be going much worse. There's all kinds of reasons for why these changes might be happening. And you can propose some potential explanations. You could say, well, I've been getting out and walking more. This is probably why I'm feeling better emotionally these days. You could be right, and you could go find research that backs that up, that to make it seem like, yeah, theoretically that should help. But ultimately, these are all just coincidences. If you want to establish a true cause and effect, you have to eventually do an experiment. You have to use experimental control. Control all the variables except for the one variable you want to put under a magnifying glass and investigate. Because until you do that, you're just looking at a bunch of correlations, and you don't ultimately know what's the real cause and what's just a coincidence. Now, correlational research is important. And in the early stages, if you just want to look for possible hypotheses, that's great. Whenever you want to have firm evidence and you're ready to start treating people and asking them for money for your treatment, you need to have better evidence than, well, I told some of my clients to start walking more, and they seem to be doing better. That's not good enough. Speaking of what seems to me to be the case, uh, many pseudoscientific treatments and applications use subjective measures. And what I mean by this is they sort of say, well, it seems to me that I'm doing much better. Or I asked some of my students, I started doing this new thing in my class. I see this all the time when I go to conferences about teaching and whatnot. Everyone says, I tried this new thing and it seems to work. And students really like it when I do this new thing I tried. That's not really objective. You can't just, if you're expecting something to work or you're trying something new and you would like it to work, you need some way of measuring whether it's working or not, and that measurement can't be your own gut. It's got to be something. You have to try to make it as objective as possible. In the context of evaluating teaching, you shouldn't say it seemed to me that it worked pretty well. You should maybe look at final exam scores for classes from before you started doing this new thing and after you started doing this new thing, although that inference has its own problems. In the context of treating mental disorders, you should have as standardized and objective as a way of measuring the severity of symptoms as you can. This might be the Beck Depression Inventory, where you assign, it's supposed to reliably assign the same numbers to the same levels of depression symptom severity in a way that is valid and reliable. You don't want to just say, I started handing my patients these new crystals, and I think that I have this theory about vibrations and megahertz, and I've been reading this new age stuff, and my tarot card reader said that this is a good idea, and it does seem to be working. The patients I gave the crystals to, they seem to have a little bit more pep in their step. No, you need hard numbers. Another common problem that you'll see with a lot of early attempts at clinical psychology and various therapeutics is that you didn't have a lot of follow ups. People would try something and the patient would be more docile, which is probably an improvement if they were someone who previously lashed out a lot and had anger issues and uh, engaged in bizarre behavior. Performing some sort of procedure on them that rendered them more docile and chill and kind of flat is probably an improvement, but a lot of times with these treatments I'm going to be talking about, you come back in a few months and they're back to doing what they were doing. So follow ups are very important, and this is just as true in the 1700s and the 1800s as it is today, because we still have problems today of uh, under investigated and poorly understood uh, therapies that don't have enough research. That's a consistent problem. Is you got to do follow-ups and see how do people do later after these therapies are conducted. So let's start off by talking about asylums. Asylums are actually very old, older than the 1700s for sure. Many people would so if they had someone whose behavior just rendered them unable to work, unable to function in society, most families would just kind of, keep them in the household and just try to manage. With a big enough city, uh, big enough civilization, every now and then someone, uh, either for charitable reasons or just out of necessity, would see that there needs to be some sort of place to keep people like this because it's a big burden on the family. So asylums have been around for quite a while. In the 1700s, you started seeing the institution of the asylum become a little more organized, a little more recognized, a little more prominent, and it was uh, it was considered a way to protect society from the insane. Although we now understand that people with severe mental disorders are actually more in danger from us than from them to us. We're not as in danger from them as they are from us. Um, and in the 1700s, that was a popular pastime. Some asylums would supplement their income, their meager income, I should say, from their benefactors, their state funding, wherever they were getting their money, by letting people come and visit the asylum as if it was a zoo. And for the longest time, asylums were mostly there just to maintain people, just keep them out of society, and just have a place for them to live so that they're not bothering other people. Um, but some attempts at treatment, there would be some attempts at treatment. And for the longest time, this was based on humor theory. You remember Hippocrates from the first module? This is where you induce vomiting, you do bloodletting. That's where you intentionally cut someone open and drain them from some of their blood. The idea was to balance their humors. If someone has too much of one kind of humor or not enough of another, you try to bring balance to even with their diet. A lot of humor-based medicine was based on the idea not just of trying to eliminate certain fluids that were in excess in the system, but also to supplement certain humors via diet. There's also this idea, this is the last bullet point here, that now not everyone thought this way, but there was this idea that the insane, quote unquote, were like beasts and they needed to be weakened in order to keep them under control. So chain them, starve them, do what you can to make them feel like they need to be kept in control and they don't have the power to escape. Very inhumane, obviously, and this is just a warning. It's not going to be the most uplifting module. There's a lot of gross stuff that we used to do. On the plus side, there was this movement called the moral treatment movement. The Quakers were big into this, and Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founding fathers here in the U.S., was also a big proponent of it. The idea behind the moral treatment movement was that people are capable of healing. You just need to give them the chance to heal. So instead of trying to balance their humors or just keep them out of society and maybe even try to weaken them and make them more docile and kind of, what do you call it? House train them, I guess. Instead, you treat the asylum not as an asylum, but as a retreat. You give them some minimal level of organization to their life, give them some routines, help them to learn to keep themselves under control and keep them calm, and gradually they will heal. You just need to let them heal and be there as a facilitator. Sounds pretty nice compared to asylums from before and alongside the moral treatment movement. Let's talk a little more about Benjamin Rush. Like I said, he's one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Like a lot of the founding fathers, it's kind of hard to call any of them progressive, because if you go and analyze anyone's ideas from the 1800s or 1700s, you're going to find some stuff that just does not jive at all with our current morals. But even then, Rush was ahead of his time. He was an abolitionist. He was in favor of educating women. I don't know if he was okay with women voting. Like I said, people don't think everyone back then was a saint just because they had a few things right. There's a lot from back then. A lot of people were half right, a quarter right, half a quarter right, not always on the right side of history. But yeah, Rush was a big backer of the moral treatment movement, and he was a proponent of using more humane treatment. He published scholarly research, and he was one of the many important figures that I'm going to talk about. Reginald Scott was another figure like this, where um, not just being a good practitioner for good practices, but also being an opponent of bad practices. So Rush was a proponent of something good, moral treatment over chaining people into asylums, but he was also an opponent of bloodletting. He actively attacked the inhumane practices of other people, which arguably I think is an important part of progress. You can't just innovate and be a do-gooder. You also have to draw attention to the people who are doing harm. And I put this graphic in here, big pharma. Um, I'm not exactly sympathetic to the pharmaceutical industry, but I also feel like a lot of psychologists, especially psychologists that write histories of psychology, have kind of a anti-pharmaceutical industry bias, which is understandable because the pharmaceutical industry they don't have the best track record. But I think we should be reasonable and assign blame where blame is due, but not turn blaming big pharma into a religion. So you can argue, though, that the medical establishment, the academic establishment, looked at the moral treatment movement and said, well, why is this working? It can't just be because you need to put people in a retreat and that's what heals mental disorders. There's got to be a physiological, biological reason. And by the way, putting people in a moral treatment facility is very expensive. It was just too impractical to scale this up to a societal level. Maybe the most wealthy people are people lucky enough to be born in a Quaker community might benefit from it, but the rest of the world was trying to figure out like what's the underlying biological mechanism for this. And the best guess they had, and they were very confident in this guess, was that people with mental illnesses just have worn out nerves. Their neurons have been firing too much and they're just no longer firing correctly. And what they need is to be soothed somehow. And that's why moral treatment worked. It's because you put them under less stressful living regimens, and it gave their neurons and their nerves a chance to heal themselves and start functioning properly again. So, to speed up this process, let's give people opiates and sedatives. This will heal their nerves. This was the first in many missteps where one group of more scientific and economically oriented people were saying we need to figure out the biological basis and made a bit of a misstep. And in general, this era, especially in the United States, but by no means exclusive to the United States, was a golden age of quackery. Quackery is just, bad medicine, pseudoscientific medical quackery. The 1800s, slightly before, slightly after, was just the Wild West of completely unregulated, bluster, miracle cures, scams. Many of the people who were coming up with these cures were sincere. They really thought it was working and they really had what at the time was state of the art medical knowledge to back it up. Some people were grifters. Um, but yeah, it was an important time to have the scientific method and have sound clinical reasoning uh, standards, but they just simply didn't. And before we cast too much blame on them, they didn't know any better, or at least it wasn't as widespread. We're going to learn about how they maybe did have a chance to know better. But we don't have an excuse nowadays. If we are failing to meet the standards of scientific proof and, do large scale follow ups and double blind experimentally controlled studies, then, we don't have an excuse. These people, at least, didn't have widespread uh, expectations of meeting certain standards. And as you'll see, a lot of this stuff had a veneer of biological or medical objectivity. So, for example, hydrotherapy, which might have included spraying people down with cold water or just giving people cold water baths. Doctors would say, look, we took their blood counts, their temperature, and this is indeed causing their temperature to go down and their blood counts to change. To me, that isn't really an indication of curing a specific ailment. It's an indication that you made someone very cold. But to them, you put someone in a freezing cold water and they act differently for a while afterwards. And then you also take some objective measurements. It makes the whole thing seem a little more objective. Another good one here, Henry Cotton. He theorized, now this was in the infancy of germ theory, viral theory. People didn't understand really how diseases were transmitted. He believed that bacteria caused mental illness, and the bacteria from your teeth are a good culprit because your teeth are close to your brain. The bacteria from your teeth could travel through the bloodstream and get into the brain and infect your brain with mental diseases. And I believe Cotton noticed that people who were missing some teeth may have been cured of certain mental diseases, or he probably didn't do very extensive studies, but he started removing people's teeth preemptively to save them from later suffering from a mental disorder. And he would note, hey, I removed people's teeth and then they never got a mental disorder. So this seems to be working. Hopefully you can see the problem with that reasoning. That wasn't the only thing people would try to do. They would remove people's genitals. You can't, because they thought that if your genitals were overstimulated, that's what causes certain disorders. They would induce comas. They would put you into a severe coma to heal you of your mental disorder. There was electroshocks. You electrocute people till the brink of death, near death. Frontal lobotomies, right? Stick this long needle up someone's nasal cavity and kind of swish it around and destroy the parts of their frontal lobe of their brain. What a lot of these therapies had in common, apart from being inhumane and disgusting, was that a lot of times afterwards, the patients would be very docile. So if you had someone in your family who was just a complete headache to try and keep under control, if you had someone who would have these panic attacks and angry outbursts and would smear feces on the walls, and then a doctor comes in explaining to you the latest medical science, how this odd treatment where you put them under a coma resets their neurons. You try the coma and voila, this person who was previously a big problem in your life is now bedridden for a while, but after they start to recover, they're a lot more calm. They're not smearing feces anywhere. They're not having angry outbursts. This might look like they are cured if you don't do too many follow-ups. If you come back months later or years later, you'll find that that coma was just a setback. People who are put through comas or electrical shock trauma are, they're incapacitated for a while, so their abnormal behaviors will be less intense and less frequent, naturally. And in a lot of ways, this is a great quote. The treatment begat the theory of illness and not vice versa. A lot of doctors would try to treat a mental illness, and when they thought it seemed to work, they would theorize, okay, why did it seem to work? They would work backwards and say, what must the biology look like if this is working so well? Of course, this logic is backwards on so many levels because it wasn't working. And that's not really how you're supposed to do medicine, is to just try things. And then if something seems to work, then you build your theories from there. So I said they should have known better at this time. That's a little unfair, but I do want to highlight that the key points in the timeline when the principles of clinical reasoning got established. So in 1747, the very first clinical trial ever, that's a strong statement, maybe that's not true, but certainly the first one that's famous, was conducted by James Lind. He was on a ship, he was sailing around, and scurvy was a very big problem. There were several sailors on the ship who contracted scurvy. And what Lind did is he said, there's all these folk remedies for scurvy. We don't know which one's really effective and which ones are just old wives' tales. So let's split these 9 or so people, 10 people, into groups of 2 or 3. I forget the exact number, but he tried a different remedy on each group of people, and he noticed that the people who had lemons and limes actually recovered from scurvy. The other people, their symptoms, fluctuated within the normal bounds of scurvy, but it's only the people who did lemons and limes that actually got significantly better. So this is a big step in the right direction. You have to compare and contrast treatments. You absolutely never ever can just try something and then note that there was a change, right? If you just went to the hospital and you said, let's try, have patients smell these essential oils, you sniff the essential oils and the patients say this, yeah, I like this, I feel real calm. That's not evidence that essential oils are doing anything. You're not comparing it to anything. You have to compare things. You have to compare treatments to other treatments. Equine therapy. Some people claim that, riding horses and doing horse-related activities is a good treatment for anxiety or depression. It might be, but you have to compare it to other similar therapies, because just having someone play with horses and saying that was fun, I feel better today, it's not. It doesn't say anything by itself. There has to be a comparison. Related to this, I'm doing this chronologically, so I'm mixing in some major figures and then later some more points in the timeline for the clinical reasoning. But we want to stop and talk about this guy, Pinel. Pinel took over an asylum in the 1790s, and he tried this new radical thing where you unchain the patients, you stop treating them like they're dangerous animals, improve their living conditions, and cut it out with the bloodletting and whatnot. Fun fact, some recent scholarship suggests that it wasn't actually Pinel's idea to do this. It's his employees, the front end workers, the front end asylum workers who deal with mentally ill patients day in and day out. Pinel just happened to notice that the workers wanted to treat the patients nicer because the workers thought that that would help. And Pinel just kind of noticed that it indeed does seem to help. So this experience got him to thinking that maybe the moral treatment movement, I don't know if he actually knew about that, but he basically said, maybe we need to treat people more humanely, don't treat them like animals, let's stop it with the bloodletting. He kept detailed case histories, which is very important. You need lots of data and records to be able to make sound inferences about what's working and what's not. And he had tremendous success. He took over other asylums and overall was a very important figure in the history of mental health treatment. Oh, but then we have this bozo, Mesmer. I forget his first name. Mesmer, gosh, Way back when, people didn't understand how neurons work. Neurons do have electrical charges, and electricity and magnetism are, of course, fundamentally related. And people in the 1700s had some vague inkling of these facts. So the idea of hovering magnets around people to treat mental illness didn't sound so crazy to them. So Mesmer pioneered this movement of using magnets to cure people. It was called animal magnetism, which sounds funny to me and maybe to you. Animal magnetism, though, was a very common word that just meant the electrical magnetic forces that underlie living organisms. And it's not so crazy because, our cells do, especially our neurons, do depend on properties of electromagnetic charges to function properly. But Mesmer became very successful with his magnet therapy. He would treat people, and people would seem to be cured, or at least their symptoms were alleviated for a time. And this, of course, the popularity of this drew a lot of concern. A commission was formed. Fun fact, Benjamin Franklin happened to be in Europe at this time in 1784. And this commission of the world's leading scientists who were available at the time were told to investigate Mesmer's methodology, and they concluded that it's a bunch of BS. It's just people are suggestible, placebo effect, this guy's a fraud. That kind of hurt Mesmer's reputation. And for some reason, mesmerism, while it did take a big PR hit in Europe, later in America, it just took off like wildfire. Um, and mesmerism was it was seen as a serious academic pursuit. Uh, Later, I'm going to talk about how doctors even thought you could use Mesmer's methods as a substitute for anesthesia. So instead of putting people under with chemicals before surgery, you could use mesmerism. People also found that you didn't even need the magnets themselves to cause the effects, the cures, the alleviation of symptoms. You could just hover your hands around them. Because after all, if there's animal magnetism in the patient, there's animal magnetism in everyone, including the doctor. The doctor could use his own or her own animal magnetic forces to interact with the patient's magnetic forces. So you don't even need the magnets. You can just hover your hands over people and cure them. You might be thinking this sounds completely insane, and people way back when in the olden times just were so gullible and stupid, we wouldn't fall for that these days. And you'd be completely wrong. Therapeutic touch, the idea, now there are different schools of thought on therapeutic touch, and there's a lot of people who'd be very offended by being lumped in with this, but there are a substantial amount of people out there who practice something called therapeutic touch. And the idea is that we have not magnetic fields, not animal magnetism, but we have waves or fields, and they talk about quantum mechanics. And they just hover their hands over the patients. They charge lots of money, I'm sure. And they say, well, look, they're magnetic, or not magnetic, their fields or their chakras or whatever are interacting with ours, and we're curing them. And notice that way back when, they would talk about the new and poorly understood phenomenon of electromagnetism and the fact that our nervous system has some electromagnetic properties that allow them to function. Therapeutic touch now incorporates the poorly understood quantum mechanics that even quantum physicists don't really understand too well. Whatever is the newest thing that sounds very sciencey at the time goes hand in hand with pseudoscience and ineffective therapies. Mesmerism eventually evolved into hypnotism, and uh, hypnotism was a very in vogue. It was a big fad. It was very widespread, and everyone believed hypnotism was a real thing. Nowadays, the evidence doesn't stack up quite as nicely. It was tried out, like I said, mesmerism, hypnotism. You ever wonder where the term mesmerized comes from? It comes from mesmer. It was tried as a surgical anesthetic, so instead of injecting the site of where the surgery is going to be conducted on the body or having someone drink a bunch of alcohol before surgery, they would hypnotize them. I'm personally not going to use that if I ever have surgery. There's this famous Nancy School, and it's a village in France that was just a big colony of um, people using hypnosis, and they did discover some things. They discovered that some people are less hypnotizable than others, which is true that some people are more suggestible than others. But also, if you're trying to promulgate this idea that hypnotism can be used to, cure mental illnesses and basically perform a exorcism by another name, saying that some people are more amenable to it than others is really just comes out to being a way of saying, well, it works when it works, but when it doesn't work, it's because I'm still right. You know, hypnotism and mesmerism and animal magnetism and all that, it still works. It's just it didn't work for you because my theory says it's not going to work for everyone. That's called being unfalsifiable. Oh, and just to take another shot at Freud, Freud was a hypnotist early in his career. Never want to shy away from digging at Freud. Returning to our milestones of clinical reasoning, the placebo effect. The placebo effect was known about by physicians for a lot longer before 1863. Physicians knew that they could give you some sort of treatment or medicine that doesn't actually have the key ingredients, but people are very suggestible. If they believe or expect this to work, then they're going to make it work because the mind is a powerful thing. However, this guy Flint in 1863 would systematically compare new remedies with a placebo. They would create a remedy that doesn't have the active ingredients that are supposed to make the new remedy effective. They would create an ineffective version of it, or so the theory goes. Like, if you think these ingredients are what helps with the symptoms, then let's take the ingredients out. We'll give some people a serum with the ingredients you say are effective, and we'll give someone a serum that's otherwise identical but without those ingredients. And we'll see, can your remedy outperform the placebo effect? And that's a big red flag. If you're looking into a new type of treatment or a new type of therapy, if it has not been compared to a placebo group or a previous remedy, or it hasn't been compared to something that's otherwise exactly the same except for the main ingredient that's supposed to be the part that's doing all the magic, then there's a good chance that it either isn't effective or there just isn't enough evidence to justify charging people money or wasting people's time with it. After that milestone, the discovery of the placebo effect and incorporating it into clinical trials, there was this German fellow named Kraepelin. Kraepelin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He studied mental disorders and he paid particular attention to the trajectory of the symptoms. How does a disorder play out over time? Schizophrenia, there are different types of schizophrenia, and the different subtypes have some symptoms at some early stages, and when you later, if you're schizophrenic, if your version of schizophrenia keeps going untreated or takes a negative turn, different symptoms can emerge. Some symptoms you had earlier will go away. Kraepelin was an extensive collector of data and case histories, and he published a book talking about the taxonomy of mental disorders. This is an early precursor to the DSM, which is now in the fifth edition. That is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's kind of like the Bible of mental disorders, except unlike the Bible, most people who like the Bible, but uh, most people who like treating mental disorders and diagnosing mental disorders usually have some sort of bone to pick with the DSM. But it is an important element. You need to have some agreed framework to study and make observations. You need to have a shared vocabulary. And also, you can't bill insurance companies if there's no diagnostic criteria or no taxonomy of disorders. So, this is an important step, probably one of the first major milestones in the development of a shared vocabulary and shared taxonomy of mental disorders. Lightner Whitmer was also a very important figure in early clinical psychology. He started the first psychology clinic in, where was it? I think he was at Penn. Might be wrong about that. You can look it up and correct me if I'm wrong. But he started the first clinic for treating psychological disorders on the campus. I think it was at Penn where he was doing that. Founded the first journal of clinical psychology. And as I've said before, this is an important role. He was a harsh critic of pseudoscientific practices. You can't just establish, good practices. You also doesn't have to be the same person, but you need to eliminate the bad as well as promote the good. And Whitmer was a very important public figure in that regard. He also founded the discipline of school psychology and special education. Quite the resume. So we're getting into the 20th century now. Darwin's theory of evolution hit in the mid to early 1800s. I can't remember if it's 1844 or 1866. It's one of those. Darwin's theory of evolution or natural selection, how do we get the different species over time, hit in the mid-ish 1800s. It had a profound effect on society. One of those profound effects was eugenics, which we have been talking about. Just as a reminder, eugenics is the view that some people are inherently better than other people. The human race would be better off if the good, intelligent, and successful people bred, while the less intelligent, less successful, and more criminal part of the human race did not breed. Eugenics, especially in America, but also in parts of Europe, was really starting to infect society in the 20th century. Many presidents of the APA were eugenicists. Mentally ill people were barred from marrying in many states. Some people were forcibly sterilized because, the public policy people figured, we have to protect the human race. We have to promote the public good. So, people who are severely mentally ill or have shown a lot of dubious character should be sterilized because we don't want those genes being passed along. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of these practices. But there was, thankfully, if there was one silver lining to World War II, it was that it basically killed eugenics. The Nazi movement was fueled in large part by eugenics, this idea that to them it's the Aryan race, but their allies over in Japan, I guess, I don't know how you square that away. I'm not a historian. But to the Germans, they thought, well, there's a German race, and we should expel all other races, and people who are inferior, people who shouldn't be breeding, Jews, gypsies, people who are handicapped, either physically or mentally, people who can't work, they should be sterilized, eradicated. Um, so yeah, in the post-World War II war, people saw I guess, the logical conclusion of what happens when eugenics runs to its, just runs amok. And uh, thankfully, I mean, obviously, World War II and the Holocaust are not good things by any means, and uh, doesn't the ends don't justify the means. One silver lining, though, is this whole eugenics thing, at least for now, in this period of history, took a big hit and became a lot less prominent. Because before that, it was a very influential idea. Now, I'm going to take a turn here. I'm about to talk about a figure in psychology who looms very large. Let's see if you can guess who I'm talking about. Um, I just want to first. Oh, I have it on the slide who I'm about to talk about. Whoops. So, there were a lot of ideas in the air in the German speaking world. There was the idea, of course, that there were different levels of consciousness. There were subconscious processes. The idea that we're only aware of some parts of our mind, that there are other parts of our mind that's working underneath the surface, and it's a mystery to us what it's really doing. That was in the air before Freud came around. The idea that we're largely driven by irrational forces and that we try to channel these irrational forces into more socially acceptable behaviors was not new, was not something Freud invented. It was something that was part of the intellectual milieu of his time. Um, Dream analysis and analysis of symbolism and free association was in vogue at the time. Oddly enough, the idea of childhood sexuality and the idea that early childhood experiences, especially traumatic childhood experiences, having a profound effect on who you become later in life, was uh, an idea that was floating around at the time. And just to jump ahead a little bit, while we're taking credit away from Freud and calling him unoriginal, I also want to say that Freud trained as a doctor, but his specialty was not very profitable. If I remember correctly, I think he specialized in some sort of like pediatric spinal treatments or something. Not a very common and profitable problem for a physician to get paid to treat. But Freud also just happened to have this colleague named Joseph Breuer, and Breuer had a woman that was suffering from hysteria, and Breuer basically tried an early version of psychoanalysis where instead of trying some sort of physical or medicinal treatment, he would just talk to the patient and try and see maybe there's something hidden underneath the surface. And Freud kind of, he would talk to Breuer and hear about these sessions, and obviously had a big impact on Freud. So that's just one more thing that Freud can't really take credit for. It kind of it kind of almost looks like Freud was just this sponge that just absorbed a lot of things that were going on around him. And also, we'll see biographically, he kind of tried all kinds of different things. We already talked about how he tried hypnotism at one point. It almost kind of seems like Freud kind of soaked up these different things, but also tried out a bunch of things and failed, and he finally hit upon something that was successful for some reason. Maybe I'm being unfair, but let's talk about Freud and his life. Uh, Freud, growing up, was his mother's favorite child. He was mommy's special boy. Oof. His dad had other families and remarried a bunch of times, and Freud had brothers that were older than his mother and nephews that were older than him. So the idea of the father figure, the mother figure, and getting mixed up with the brothers, and that got all out of whack for Freud. So not to psychoanalyze Freud too much, but his sort of mental representations and symbology of the figureheads of a young child's life was very different from other people at his time and for many people nowadays. Like I said, he trained as a physician. He tried to be a practitioner of hypnotism at some point, and for a very large portion of his life, he was a very big proponent of cocaine. He would snort cocaine all the time. He said it made him more productive, more attentive, more energetic. I believe it. That's what cocaine does. Probably a hard habit to kick. I don't know. I've heard that. Just some of the basic, not getting too deep into Freudian psychodynamic theory or psychoanalytic theory, just going to kind of cover the main gist of it. So, Freud believed that our conscious life is just the tip of the iceberg, and that really deep down we are these animalistic, bestial, perverted sickos that slowly, through the course of early infancy and childhood, we learn to divert all this, what he called libido energy or libidinal energy. We find ways to engage in more socially acceptable behaviors because the shame and anxiety that we feel from engaging in our deepest, darkest urges, keeps us from wanting to do that, actually. Let's see. His method for arriving at his theory, if you can call it that, was based on dream analysis. He studied slips of the tongue. So, for instance, you ever heard of a Freudian slip? That's like when someone accidentally says the wrong thing, but actually maybe was saying the right thing all along. Like when, God, I can't think of any examples. Let's see, what's an example of I probably shouldn't Google Freudian slip on my computer. Who knows what kind of smut I'm going to come across. Freudian slip example. Not safe for work. Let's see. Oh, come on, just give me an example. What do we have here? Freudian slipping, literally. Oh, you're hilarious. A slip like a dress. What is this? What is this lady saying? I'm sorry, Mr. President. I mean bird flu strategy, not bird-brained strategy. All right, that'll do. So, like, if you hear your boss's plan to treat bird flu, and you say, "Okay, I'll go tell everyone about your bird flu idea," that would be an example of a Freudian slip because you didn't mean to say it was bird-brained. You meant to say it's a bird flu strategy, but your real feelings kind of snuck out by accident. You were trying to repress certain thoughts because it's inappropriate to tell your boss that he's an idiot and that his idea is bird-brained. I never have good Freudian slip examples on the tip of my tongue. That's usually because I just have examples of making fun of Freudian slips. Like, have you ever heard of a Freudian slit? Or have you ever heard of a Freudian tit? Or, I don't know. To Freud, that would if you accidentally called something with a slit or a tit, you'd have all kinds of theories about why you said that. Let's see. Some of this, those are the main ideas. I'm going to go over id, ego, superego, and some of his ego defense mechanisms, but there's only so much Freud that I'm actually going to test you on. And if you're really interested in Freud, you're welcome to go read more about it. Personally, I mean, I'm biased. There are probably some people out there. They're in the minority nowadays, but there are some people who are still advocates of Freud. But there's really some of this stuff just isn't even relevant and just kind of gross. So the primitive bestial part of us that we have to learn to uh, inhibit is called the id. If you ever hear someone being called pure id, like, oh, have you met the new receptionist? She is pure id. That means they're out of control. They do the first thing that comes to their mind. They might have some rude, crude habits, like they pick their nose or whatever. They don't act appropriately. That's the id. It's just all of your urges and your inappropriate behaviors, self-indulgent. The superego is a part of your ego, but I'm going to actually come back to the ego. The superego is responsible for finding ways to channel the id, and we're going to give some examples down here. I'm not going to go through all of these. But the ego is basically that little thin slice of your mind that you're consciously aware of. Your perceptions and your memories and everything that's part of your conscious life is your ego. And you need to defend your ego from anxiety. So if you have some unpleasant memories, some embarrassing moments, or some traumatic moments, one thing the superego might do is repress certain memories. Displacement. Displacement is when you would like to lash out or engage in some sort of inappropriate behavior, but since it's socially unacceptable to do so, your superego gets you to take that energy and go displace it onto something else. So, one example I often use of this is let's say you have a fancy dinner party and you have the in laws and some work colleagues and over, and your children are embarrassing you with their behavior, and you want to kind of lose it and start yelling at them at the top of your lungs like you usually do, but you don't want to look like a crazy, out of control parent with anger issues. So instead of yelling at your kids, you just kind of say, okay, remember, behave yourself. And all the anger you usually take out on your kids, you instead go and yell at your dog. And you say, bad Rover, bad. Oh, he was licking the whatever. And you start taking it out on the dog. That would be displacement. You're taking what would have been an inappropriate behavior, like yelling at your kids, and instead going yell at your dog, which is a little bit more socially acceptable. I'll just talk about the next two. I'm not going to go through all of these. Sublimation is when there's something the id wants to do, but it's unacceptable socially to do it. So the superego gives the id something kind of similar to do to kind of appease it, not completely appease it, but give it a little taste of what it really wants to do. So, for instance, I hate to talk about such a dark subject, but with pedophilia, that's usually an example people give of sublimation. So, if someone has urges, pedophilic urges, that would be coming from their id. Their superego would recognize that you can't touch kids, you can't violate kids. That'd be very bad. So instead, why don't you start watching true crime documentaries focusing specifically on cases of, uh, child rapists and really get into the details and maybe even become a little bit of an expert on molestation cases and maybe become an advocate for certain children groups and organizations. So that way, you're doing something that might seem nice from the outside. You're concerned about child welfare and you're actually learning about an important issue. And people might say, wow, what a great guy. When really deep down, it's because part of you wishes you can engage in those behaviors. Kind of dark. That's the idea behind sublimation. All right, last one, projection. Projection is when your id wants to engage in a certain behavior and you therefore assume everyone else has those behaviors they want to engage in. Like, say, if you are constantly tempted to dine and dash and, shoplift and you kind of stretch the truth a lot, and deep down you're constantly having to fight those urges. Projection is when you assume everyone else has those same urges. You're struggling with being a thieving, lying little thief, and so you assume everyone else is like that too. I actually kind of agree to some extent with the idea of projection. I think a lot of Freud's ideas are completely harebrained or bird-brained, according to that comic. But one thing I do believe is, when I start talking to other college professors, they're often shocked by the fact that I don't advocate using the proctoring services. So usually, when you do an online class, a lot of professors are real big into, yeah, you charge them the $50 and someone will watch them take their exam, and they have to show the different parts of their room to show no one's hiding near the computer to help them with their exams, and the proctor can see what they're doing on their computer and make sure they're not looking anything up. And it's not a very trustful situation. And yeah, there are certainly college students who have earned that distrust. But I sometimes wonder if college professors who are this distrusting of cheaters are maybe not just someone who's a bit of a cheater themselves. Like maybe they didn't engage in cheating when they were a college student, but they're someone who is tempted to cheat, not necessarily in an academic setting, but they have that urge to cheat and to lie and to misrepresent the truth and to stretch the rules. So they assume everyone else is like that, and they need to make sure and catch people. They're especially uh, vigilant against people because that's how they are. And maybe it's because, I don't know, I hate to say, like, oh no, I'm this noble, righteous, I would never cheat or steal. But I really do believe, like, for you to be that paranoid and that vigilant and to like make students pay $50 for this proctoring service, I just can't understand that. I know some people are going to cheat, and that does bother me, but I, I, I can't see why you would be so intensely concerned about that unless you've got some sort of hang up yourself. That would be an example of projection. I really do kind of believe that. That's not the only reason professors insist on using those proctoring services, but I think sometimes that's the reason. But those are all the ego defense mechanisms I can stomach talking about with Freud. There's also the psychosexual stages. I can only stomach talking about so many of these too. According to Freud, the struggles that we go through at different phases in our life are going to affect our habits later in life. He said, when we're a young infant, our main source of pleasure and discomfort and nourishment is through the mouth. So he calls it the oral stage. You either receive reliable gratification through the mouth, or you have hang-ups, like if your mother didn't feed you enough. That's why some people become smokers, or why some people have eating disorders, is because they didn't get the gratification they needed during their oral stage. A similar logic applies to the anal stage, the phallic stage, and the genital stage. I am not going to talk about those stages. I think you get the idea, and I'm not going to dignify Freud by talking about them any more than anyone should. I give Freud a hard time, but he's kind of asking for it. He's a lot to deal with. But there's a lot of reasons why Freud's ideas, at least in Europe, didn't. They kind of peaked relatively early. Now, the same can't be said about psychoanalysis in the United States, but at least in Europe, one of the reasons Freud's ideas probably peaked at some point is because Freud did have Jewish heritage, and the Nazi movement was very unfriendly towards anything they perceived as being a Jewish influence on otherwise good, wholesome German ideals. Um, Eventually, psychoanalysis kind of fell by the wayside in the United States. We're eventually going to talk about behaviorism and the so called cognitive revolution. And nowadays, behavior analysis or therapies based on cognitive theory are kind of the dominant ways of trying to help people. Psychoanalysis is not very common these days. But there are aspects of psychoanalytic theory that do seem to hold up. So the fact that we are not conscious of everything that's going on in our mind, that's just straight up true. Every every bit of current psychological science that you read would agree with that. And I think it is important to keep in mind that we aren't necessarily aware of the real reasons why we do things. That's a very annoying Freudian thing to do, is to explain to people why the real reason why they're doing the things they do. But I think it's important to remember you don't necessarily know why you did the things you did. You might be rationalizing, providing reasons for what you did after the fact. I think that's in your own personal life. You should keep that in mind. So why on earth would someone want to criticize this stuff? I can't imagine. I'll just go over a few of the things people had to say about Freudian theory. One of the problems with Freudian theory is this idea of repressed memories. So Freud believed that if you got people, people repressed traumatic events from their life, and that's what causes them a lot of anxiety and a lot of abnormal behaviors and distress. You need to unlock those memories and figure out what happened. That's part of the healing process. That's how you resolve these issues. The problem is people are very suggestible, and you can definitely alter people's memories by asking leading questions. And there have been several cases where a therapist implanted the idea of a childhood trauma, perhaps even a sexual trauma, into someone's head, and it caused serious legal troubles. It broke families apart, and then later it would be proven that the therapist was using leading questions and that there's exonerating evidence. Obviously, we should take all accusations and allegations of childhood sexual assault seriously. What we don't need is someone getting up in those waters and muddying them by creating false allegations to mix in with the true allegations. It's the last thing we need. Another big criticism is that the whole theoretical edifice is built off of Freud's own personal anecdotal experience. Nowadays, when you need to establish a theory, you need to use systematic empirical evidence. You need to say, I've got a hypothesis, and if my hypothesis is true, when I gather my data, you're going to see this effect. Lo and behold, here's the effect. Now, let's try and think of counter explanations. What are some other explanations that could explain this effect? Let's run some studies and try to rule them out. That's not at all what Freud did. Freud said, this seems how things work to me, and this is how it works. Another criticism of Freud's theory is that it's unfalsifiable. When I explained what falsifiability was, I mentioned Freud. If you met a man who had let's say, sexual deviancy problems, like if you met a man that was so out of control trying to hook up with women all the time and getting into trouble with that, a Freudian might say, well, what's going on is that he's actually a homosexual. And the idea of him coming out as gay or acknowledging his true gay side is causing him so much distress that he's undergoing reaction formation. So he's engaging in the opposite behavior and to try and compensate for what he really wants to do. That's certainly one theory. If you try to go gather evidence that's consistent with this theory, there's a chance you might find some evidence of that. But also, I mean, what would happen if you find evidence that no, I think this guy really is a heterosexual male. He just has sexual dysfunctional problems. And I don't think this has to do with his sexuality. I think it has to do with his behavioral regulation. You know, look at this evidence that he's really heterosexual. I don't know what that evidence would really be like. I'll let you imagine. If you showed that evidence to a Freudian, they could always say, well, you know, he left that evidence behind because that's how nervous he is about people thinking that he's a homosexual. There's kind of no winning with a Freudian. If they have a theory of why the real reason why we're doing the things that we do, there's kind of no talking them out of it, depending on how stubborn they want to be. And the last criticism is what's with all the weird sex stuff? Freud managed to have a couple of followers. I mean, he had lots of fans, but people actually traveling to go study under Freud, there were some. And what would inevitably happen is that they would ask Freud at some point, they'd say, hey, old Siggy, I love this stuff is great. The unconscious, I think that's totally right. And these ego defense mechanisms, I think that's a great way of explaining people's behavior. And, you seem to be really on the right track with this stuff. But what's with all this like Oedipus complex and like boys want to bang their moms and girls are jealous of their fathers because their fathers have a penis and like what the hell? However, they actually phrased this stuff, I'm sure they wouldn't have phrased it that way. The topic would always eventually come up, and Freud is not the kind of man who will sit there and listen to any criticism. Freud had a massive ego. He was dogmatic. He will not allow anyone to question him. Anytime someone questioned him on any part of his theory, they had a big falling out. So you're going to see that as I go over some of the psychoanalysts who came after Freud. One of the major figures in the psychoanalytic movement was Anna Freud, which must have been awkward as Freud's oldest daughter. Can you imagine if you're a lady and you're talking to your dad, and your dad's talking about how deep down every girl wants to have sex with her dad and looks to her dad as the ultimate male prototype? And God, I mean, I can't imagine how that conversation would not be awkward. But anyway, however awkward it may have been being Freud's daughter, Anna Freud did a lot of important work on expanding psychoanalytic theory to helping treat children, and she made original contributions to the original version of psychoanalysis that her father pioneered. Probably Freud's most famous pupil, and who also had a very famous falling out with Freud, was Carl Jung. Jung basically had the conversation with Freud at one point. He said, what's with all the weird sex stuff? And Freud said, get the hell out of my house. And they never talked again. Jung made some original contributions. He came up with this theory of the collective unconscious, which is like the sort of the unconscious symbols that we all kind of share universally in our culture, which is related to the idea of archetypes. A lot of people in literary analysis like to talk about archetypes. It's a very Jungian idea. If you have ever heard of, I think is it Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. Joseph Campbell, I think if I'm remembering his name correctly, is very big in liberal arts, creative writing, Hollywood writers, hero's journey. It's this idea that certain characters are the archetypical, like the young hero who's sent on the journey, and there's the older quest giver, and he would apply these and say, look, all of our mythologies, all of our novels, and all of our movies have these certain archetypes and cycles in them. And in general, Jung just kind of took the very essence of psychoanalytic theory, the fact that we have these symbolic associations and we're not fully conscious of every aspect of our mind, and kind of cleansed it of all the weird sex stuff and added his own stuff to that. There's also Alfred Adler. He came up with the ideas of an inferiority complex, which is the idea that what drives a lot of our behavior is the fact that we compare ourselves disfavorably to others and we can't stand the idea of being inferior. We must feel superior. I believe it. He also was a big, he talked a lot about how birth order matters. So you compare the behavior of an only child to someone who grew up in a large family where they had to maybe make a lot of sacrifices and had to share their parents' attention with other children and maybe had to kind of grow up quick just because they had to help and be there for their siblings. Being the middle child is different from being the youngest child psychologically. These are all very Adlerian ideas. Oh, last slide. Then you had I think her name's Karen Horney. It's pronounced Horney. I had to look that up. Horney was a big figure in psychoanalysis, and importantly, she spoke up for the kind of grim picture of what a woman's psyche was like. You had all these men talking about what women were really like deep down in their minds, and Horney said, "Well, hold on a minute there," and corrected them. And and this might kind of segue into this, maybe not, maybe I'm being a bad feminist, but Horney also emphasized how important the dynamics of interacting with other people are in terms of how you develop and how you behave as a person. You're not just this solitary id struggling with a superego. You're integrated into a social situation, and that matters a lot. All right, well, that's it for Module 3, and I will see y'all in Module 4.